There is a kind of map that cannot be drawn on paper, one that lives inside the hearts of the people who have been set free. It stretches from the deepest ocean floor to the tallest sky island, from the misty coasts of the East Blue to the storm-wrapped mountains of the New World. Monkey D. Luffy has never once asked for an empire, and if you said the word territory to his face, he would probably not understand why anyone would care about such a thing. So subscribe for more calm One Piece stories tonight, and if it feels right, let me know where you are listening from in the quiet hours. Starting with the very first place that ever called itself his. Fishman Island, 10,000 meters beneath the ocean surface, resting in permanent darkness and in permanent wonder. Before one can begin to understand what Luffy owns, it is worth sitting quietly with what it means to own something in the world of One Piece at all. A Yonko's territory is not a castle wall or a bordered field on a map. It is a kind of promise, an unspoken agreement between a powerful pirate and the people who live under their shadow, that no harm will come to them so long as that pirate's name is spoken aloud. The four emperors of the sea before Luffy rose each commanded their territories through presence and through fear. Kaido held Wano closed like a fist. Big Mom surrounded herself with islands bound to her through a terrible kind of love. Shanks moved slowly, and his name alone stopped wars. Blackbeard gathered darkness wherever he sailed. Luffy is different from all of them, and this is not simply because he is young, or because he is loud, or because his ability to reason sometimes leaves his crewmates quietly exhausted. He is different because every place that belongs to him became his the same way. He walked in when someone was suffering. He decided, without consulting anyone, that the suffering needed to stop. And then, through will and through something the world of One Piece calls haki, though it might be easier to call it kindness with very strong arms, the suffering stopped. The people who were saved remember, and that memory, stretched across oceans and down through years, is what a Luffy territory is built from. There are some islands where his flag flies openly, planted by his own hand or given willingly by a king. There are others where no flag flies, but where every person would run toward him in a crisis instead of away. There are still others that remain complicated, bound by world government loyalty, or by geography, or by the strange truth that Luffy does not always return to the places he has freed. Each of these deserves to be understood on its own terms, slowly and without rushing, the way you might walk through a museum at the end of a long day, pausing at each painting long enough to let it say what it wants to say. The system of Yonko territories is old. It predates Luffy by generations. Goldie Roger, the Pirate King, commanded something like it in his time, the awe of the world and the loyalty of whoever sailed beside him. But Roger's era ended with his death, and the territories he had gathered dissolved back into the uncertain seas within years of his execution. Whitebeard, Edward Newgate, built the most elaborate version of the system in recent memory. He had sons, not biological children, but pirates who called him father and meant it. Spread across the seas. He had villages and islands under his protection, and the promise attached to his name was one of the most reliable in the world. When Whitebeard said a place was his, other pirates did not challenge it. The cost of challenging it was too clear. His death at Marineford changed everything it could reach. The vacuum left by the fall of the strongest man in the world opened spaces in the balance of power that have been slowly filling since. Blackbeard moved into some of those spaces. The world government moved into others. And the Straw Hat Pirates, sailing through arc after arc without fully realizing the shape they were making, moved into the rest. What Luffy has accumulated is not Whitebeard's system reborn. It is something genuinely new. It has the practical elements, places under protection, crews who swear loyalty, islands that would answer a call. But the logic underneath those elements is different. Whitebeard protected his people because he loved them, and that love was real, but it was still organized around him. He was the sun, and the family orbited. Luffy's relationship with his territories is less centralized. The people at Fishman Island did not become his in order to orbit him. They became his because they wanted what he represented, which is not obedience to a stronger power, but the simple certainty that their suffering would not be allowed to continue unchallenged. These are meaningfully different things. There are some islands where his flag flies openly, planted by his own hand or given willingly by a king. There are others where no flag flies but where every person would run toward him in a crisis instead of away. There are still others that remain complicated, bound by world government loyalty, or by geography, or by the strange truth that Luffy does not always return to the places he is freed. Each of these deserves to be understood on its own terms, slowly and without rushing, the way you might walk through a museum at the end of a long day, pausing at each painting long enough to let it say what it wants to say. So let us begin at the bottom of the sea. The fishmen have lived beneath the surface of the ocean for longer than most history books remember to record. Their kingdom, the Ryugu Kingdom, sits at the base of the Red Line, in a cavern of enormous beauty that the light from the surface never quite reaches on its own. For most of the story, Fishman Island existed in a strange kind of political twilight. It was officially protected by a Yonko, but that protection came from Big Mom, and it came at a price. Each month, a tribute of candy was required. Each month, the kingdom paid it. The fishmen had lived under that shadow for years without a clear way out. Their king, Neptune, was a man of great dignity and great age. His daughter, Shirahoshi, was gentle in a way that seemed almost too fragile for the world she had been born into. When the Straw Hats arrived, descending through the dark water in their coated ship, they were not arriving as rescuers. They were simply passing through, heading deeper into the Grand Line, caught up in the ordinary chaos that follows Luffy everywhere he sails. What happened next unfolded the way most important things in Luffy's story unfold, without a plan, in response to something that was simply wrong. Hody Jones had taken the kingdom by force. He was a fishman who had built his identity entirely on hatred, hatred of humans, hatred of anyone who had chosen peace over conflict, hatred of the very idea that two peoples could live without one being placed beneath the other. He intended to execute King Neptune in front of his own people to make a point about power. Luffy defeated him. This is not a simple sentence, even though it reads like one. To defeat Hody Jones required Luffy to have grown significantly since his early days in the East Blue, to have survived the horror of the Summit War at Marineford, to have trained for 2 full years on Rusukena Island, under the watchful eye of the former warlord Silver's Rayleigh. When Hody was defeated and the kingdom was safe, and the moment had passed into the strange calm that follows great violence, Luffy said something that nobody had quite expected. He told the fishmen that Fishman Island was his. It was said the way he says most things, too loud, too direct, without the diplomatic cushioning that a statement of that size probably deserved. Big Mom was still alive. Big Mom was still powerful. Claiming her former tributary was not a cautious move. But caution has never been a currency Luffy trades in. The full weight of what he said did not land on the room immediately. King Neptune's court had spent decades navigating the careful language of people who understood that the wrong words spoken to the wrong powerful person could result in the destruction of everything they had spent their lives maintaining. And here was a young man in a straw hat declaring in front of everyone that Big Mom's territory was no longer Big Mom's. For a moment, the room was very quiet. And then, in the chapter that followed, King Neptune's court requested a straw hat flag to fly above the kingdom. This is the detail that matters. It was not Luffy who formalized the relationship. It was the kingdom itself. They chose to align with him. The flag was the seal. The request for the flag is worth understanding in its historical context. For most of Fishman Island's recorded history, the kingdom had operated under the flags of others, under the shadow of whichever power claimed the right to offer protection in exchange for tribute. The Ryugu kingdom had survived by navigating between forces that were larger than itself, keeping its dignity intact by making the compromises necessary to prevent something worse. To request Luffy's flag was to make a different kind of choice. It was not navigating between forces, it was committing to one. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm One Piece stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. This was Luffy's first official territory, and it remains one of the most quietly significant locations in the entire story. Not because of its size or its military strength, but because of what it carries and who lives there. Shirahoshi is the ancient weapon known as Poseidon. This title, ancient and heavy as it sounds, refers to a specific and extraordinary ability. She can communicate with the Sea Kings, the enormous creatures that swim beneath the surface of the world's oceans, older than most kingdoms and larger than most warships. The Sea Kings do not serve her out of compulsion. They come to her because she calls, and they come because something in her voice is a frequency they have been waiting for across thousands of years of silence. The first time this power was revealed, it was enough to hold the giant ship Noah in place above the island, a vessel so large that its weight alone could have destroyed Fishman Island on impact. The ability to call Sea Kings is something that the story has treated with the care appropriate to something of enormous consequence. Sea Kings are not simply large, they are the largest living things in the world, creatures whose length is measured in kilometers, whose movement through water displaces tides. A single Sea King of the great variety can overturn a ship the size of a small city. What Shirahoshi can do is not just call one. She can call all of them. The extent of this has not been fully demonstrated, because the full demonstration of Poseidon's power is something the story appears to be saving for the moment when the world most needs to understand what it is. But the suggestion of it, the way the Sea Kings respond to her voice even at the level of the first small demonstration, gives a clear indication of the scale. This connection between Shirahoshi and the Sea Kings is not simply a dramatic power. In the context of the end of the story, it becomes something closer to a lifeline for the world. As the events of the Egghead Island arc have begun to reveal, the world has been flooded before. The Red Line and the Grand Line exist as they do partly because of ancient geological events tied to the power of the world government and the weapons they have wielded or triggered. If the final conflict of One Piece involves the kind of catastrophic upheaval that reshapes ocean and land, then the ability to call Sea Kings becomes the ability to carry survivors through rising water to safety. The giant ship Noah, still resting somewhere near Fishman Island, becomes in this reading not just an artifact of ancient architecture, but a vessel of salvation, something built by a people who understood that the world floods and designed accordingly. The scale of Noah is difficult to overstate. It was built to carry living creatures, multiple species, in large numbers, which suggests that whoever designed it understood what it would need to do. The interior of the ship, as glimpsed during the Fishman Island arc, shows chambers and passages that speak to long-term habitation rather than short voyages. This is not a warship and not a trading vessel. It is something built for a specific and serious purpose. Beyond Shirahoshi and beyond Noah, Fishman Island also contributes something more straightforwardly military. The Fishmen are extraordinary underwater fighters. A single capable Fishman warrior can dismantle a naval ship from below, moving through water at speeds no human-crewed vessel can match. An army of Fishmen changes the entire nature of a sea battle. The martial traditions of Fishman Island are codified in a system called Fishman Karate and its sister discipline, Fishman Judo. These arts use water itself as a weapon, the moisture in the air, the water inside an opponent's body, the ocean beneath the feet. A practitioner of high-level Fishman Karate can send a shockwave through the ocean's surface at a distance, striking opponents who are not even in the water. A practitioner of Fishman Judo can throw an enemy by manipulating the water in the sea itself as though it were a solid object. Jinbei, now the Straw Hat Pirate's helmsman, is himself a fishman, and his strength in the water is something that even his crewmates, each of whom is exceptional in their own right, regard with genuine respect. The kingdom's formal relationship with the world government remains somewhat ambiguous. King Neptune and Princess Shirahoshi attended the reverie, the Council of World Leaders held in Maria Joie, for the first time in over 200 years, which suggests some level of official recognition. But their hearts have always been positioned elsewhere, and when the final chapter of this story begins to write itself, there is very little doubt about which direction Fishman Island will sail. It would be easy to look at Fishman Island and see it only as a beginning, the first territory, the first flag, the first act of an emerging emperor claiming something for himself. But the more carefully you look at what Fishman Island actually represents, the more it feels like something that was always going to be here, placed at the foundation of Luffy's future, like a stone under a cathedral floor. The Fishmen have carried a burden through the history of the One Piece world that mirrors, in quieter and more painful ways, the burden that the people of Wano would later carry under Kaido. They have been looked down upon, placed beneath, told that their difference made them lesser. The discrimination against fishmen is one of the story's oldest and most persistent threads. This discrimination did not begin with Hody Jones or with Arlong. It began much earlier, in the unnamed centuries before the current story, when the two peoples first began to share oceans and the question of how to share them was answered, as such questions often are, with hierarchy rather than with fairness. Fishmen were made to feel that the surface world, the world of sunlight and open air, was not for them, and that their place beneath the waves was a position rather than simply a geography. Luffy's declaration over Fishman Island was not just a strategic claim, it was a statement, however accidental, about what kind of emperor he intended to be, one whose territories are defined not by tribute and not by fear, but by the refusal to let suffering continue. Fisher Tiger, the legendary fishman who died before Luffy ever reached the Grand Line, spent his life trying to articulate what freedom meant for his people. He had been enslaved by the world nobles, the celestial dragons who live above Maria Joie and who treat other people as objects to be owned. He escaped. He came back. He freed the slaves, fishmen and humans alike, because he understood that the category of the enslaved was not defined by species. The legend of Fisher Tiger is told in the Fishman Island arc with a quietness that contrasts with its content. His was a life of enormous pain, channeled into action that changed things. He did not live to see the change fully manifest. He died carrying a wound that could have been healed if he had accepted human blood, and he did not accept it, and the story does not pretend that this was simple or uncomplicated. Jinbe spent years trying to translate Fisher Tiger's vision into something the world could hold. He became a warlord partly in the hope that the status would protect Fishman Island from the most direct forms of marine aggression. He walked a tightrope above the most hostile waters in the world's politics for years, waiting for a moment when the balance could shift. Otohime, Shirahoshi's mother, gave her life petitioning for a world where fishmen and humans could live without walls between them. She collected signatures. She stood in front of crowds. She spoke about the possibility of coexistence with a conviction that never seemed to diminish, regardless of how many people doubted her. She was murdered for it. All of those lives, all of those efforts, eventually accumulated into this: a young man from the East Blue with a straw hat and a flag, shouting that this kingdom was his, and meaning it in the only way he knows how to mean things, completely. When Luffy made his declaration on Fishman Island, it was not the culmination of a political strategy. It was the next expression of something that had been building since Shanks gave him that hat on the dock at Fuchsia Village and said, "Someday, give it back to me when you've become a great pirate." The flag is an echo of that hat. The territory is an echo of that promise. In time, the Fishman's contribution to the final chapter of the story will likely be understood as something that could not have been replaced by any other alliance, not because of their strength alone, or because of Noah, or because of Shirahoshi's power, but because they were first. Because Fishman Island stands at the beginning of Luffy's imperial story, and beginnings shape everything that follows. To understand why Wano matters as a territory, you first have to understand what Wano was before Luffy arrived. Wano Kuni is an island nation in the New World, positioned along the outer edges of the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the known world. It is surrounded by powerful waterfalls and treacherous sea terrain, and for hundreds of years it had maintained a policy of total isolation. No ships in, no ships out. No world government presence within its borders. This isolation was born from pride. The samurai of Wano believed in the strength of their swords and the honor of their code, and they saw no reason to invite the complications of outside relationships into a world they had built carefully and quietly over centuries. The swordsmanship tradition of Wano is among the most refined in the world. Its blades are famous: Wado Ichimonji, Enma, Shusui, and the people who carry those blades understand their craft in a way that goes beyond technique into something closer to philosophy. The sword in Wano is not simply a weapon, it is a relationship between the person who holds it and the world they move through. But 20 years before the Straw Hats arrived, everything that isolation had protected was taken away from the inside. Kurozumi Orochi, with the backing of the Emperor Kaido and the power of the Beast's pirates, seized control of Wano. The samurai who resisted were defeated. The daimyo who refused to comply were destroyed. The factories that had once made goods for the people of Wano were converted to produce weapons for Kaido's ambitions, and the pollution from those factories was allowed to spread into the rivers and the soil. A generation grew up hungry and sick in a country that had once been beautiful. The old Wano, the clean rivers, the abundant food, the cherry blossoms that the samurai wrote poems about, existed only in the memories of the oldest survivors and in the stories they told their children. The flower capital, the central city of Wano, continued to function. It had festivals, it had wealth, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of Orochi's allies, and the celebrations happened while the other regions starved. Kuri, Ringo, Udon, the outer territories of Wano, were depleted. The people there scraped. They made do. They did not speak loudly about what they knew. Kozuki Oden, the rightful heir to the shogunate and a man of almost mythological proportions in Wano's history, had died trying to change this. He was publicly executed, and the manner of his death boiled alive in a pot, standing upright for 1 full hour to buy freedom for his retainers, outlasting every expectation anyone held of human endurance, became the story that defined what Wano had lost. His retainers, the 9 red scabbards, had survived and hidden and waited. His son, Momonosuke, had been sent forward in time through the power of a devil fruit, arriving in the present as a child while his contemporaries had aged 2 decades. When Luffy arrived in Wano, he did not arrive because he had a plan. He arrived because Kinemon had asked for help, and because the injustice of what had happened to Wano was the kind of injustice that Luffy cannot observe without responding. He arrived quietly, actually, in disguise, under an alias, without the fanfare that tends to follow him. He worked in Wano for a period as a laborer, which is not a situation that Luffy typically navigates with ease, and yet somehow he managed to move through the early stages of the operation without immediately destroying everything by accident. The alliance that followed, the Straw Hats, the Heart Pirates, the Kid Pirates, the Red Scabbards, the remnants of the Kozuki Loyalists, was one of the most complex and carefully assembled fighting forces in the story's history. It still nearly failed, multiple times, in ways that left crewmates unconscious, bleeding, or floating on debris above the ruins of Onigashima. The raid on Onigashima was not clean. Nothing about it matched the plan that had been assembled, the timing that had been counted on, or the alliances that had been assumed stable. Kanjuro's betrayal unraveled critical elements of the preparation. The burning of the Kozuki fleet before the raid even began compressed the options available. The island itself, Onigashima, began to move toward the flower capital, which meant that a failure to end the battle quickly would result in mass civilian casualties. Luffy fought through all of it. He was defeated, twice at least, before the final confrontation on the rooftop. He fell. He was recovered. He returned, the sequence in which he came back from apparent defeat by discovering a new form of his power, the awakening of Gear 5, and the manifestation of what the world calls the sun god Nika, is one of the most viscerally celebrated moments in the story's history. But in the end, Luffy stood on the roof of Onigashima beneath a sky that had been split open by the force of the fight, and he defeated Kaido. The man who had been called the strongest creature in the world, the man who had said out loud, more than once, that Luffy could not win. Afterward, Luffy gave Wano his flag. The ceremony was not elaborate. There was no formal transfer of authority, no signing of documents, no public address to the people of Wano about what the flag meant in political terms. It was given the way Luffy gives most things, simply, directly, as though it were obvious and did not require explanation. Wano was free. The flag said what it needed to say. When a territory is left behind by a Yonko who cannot be everywhere at once, what guards it in the interim is the strength of the people who remain. Wano, in this regard, is genuinely extraordinary among Luffy's holdings. Yamato, the daughter of Kaido, chose to stay in Wano after the battle, not because she was forced to, but because she believed Wano needed someone of her strength present during its recovery. Her power is something that exists at the very edge of what most fighters in the story can approach. She trained under her father's impossible standard, carried the will of Kozuki Oden, and fought Kaido himself for an extended period during the battle for Onigashima. Yamato's devil fruit, which she ate while imprisoned, and which her father considered so significant that he kept her confined partly to prevent her from leaving, allows her to transform into a mythical Zoan form connected to the ancient wolf deity of Wano's mythology. The power this provides is physical and elemental, ice and force combined in a form that moves with the weight of myth behind it. That she remains in Wano is, from a purely defensive standpoint, equivalent to leaving behind an entire fleet. Momonosuke, aged forward through the artificial devil fruit eaten by his mother, now exists in a form that approaches adulthood. His control over his dragon form grows steadily. During the climax of the Wano arc, he flew through the sky in dragon form and held Onigashima in place long enough to redirect its descent, an act that required both physical power and the mental discipline to maintain it under enormous pressure. When an admiral faced him down, he did not retreat. The significance of Momonosuke's character development cannot be overstated within the context of what Wano will be. He is the shogun now, the leader of a country that spent 2 decades under occupation, that watched its people suffer and its traditions be suppressed. His leadership of the country's recovery is the stewardship of something that nearly did not survive at all. His relationship with Zunesha, the giant elephant whose footsteps can be felt as tremors along the ocean floor, is another thread the story has established without yet fully pulling. Momonosuke heard Zunesha's voice. He gave Zunesha a command. The connection between the Kozuki lineage and Zunesha runs deep into the Void Century, and its full meaning is still resolving. The Red Scabbards, Kinemon, Raizo, Denjiro, Ashura Doji, Inuarashi, and Nekomamushi in their Sulong forms, each represent a tier of combat ability that would be considered exceptional anywhere in the world. Inuarashi and Nekomamushi, the rulers of the Minks, are among the most powerful fighters in the story. In their Sulong forms, triggered by the full moon, they operate at a level that places them directly in the conversation about the strongest Yonko commanders. They have already proven this. The fact that they call Wano home, at least in part, is something that any enemy would need to account for before considering any action against the country. The samurai of Wano in general, the ordinary swordsmen, not the exceptional few, represent a military tradition that has been refined over generations without interruption by outside influence or world government standardization. Wano's isolation meant that its martial arts developed on their own terms, in their own direction, shaped by the specific philosophy of the country rather than by whatever the marine curriculum teaches. Tama, the young girl who befriended Luffy during his first days in Wano, carries a power that does not look like what it is. Her devil fruit allows her to create small dango from her cheek that, when eaten by animals or Zoan-type devil fruit users, convert them to her side. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The battlefield implications of Tama's ability were demonstrated dramatically during the raid on Onigashima, when she turned thousands of Smile Devil Fruit users, soldiers who had been fighting for Kaido, into sudden allies. An entire portion of the enemy force simply switched sides mid-battle. The strategic value of this in any large-scale conflict is difficult to overstate. The Smile users who ate the energy steroids had been robbed of the ability to express sorrow or pain, the cruel side effect of the defective fruits Doflamingo's factory had produced. Tama's dango giving them back a direction to commit to was, in its own small and strange way, a kind of restoration. They did not regain what had been taken from them, but they were given something to move toward. Tama's dream is to be a ninja. She trained under Komachio. She has the seriousness of a child who has decided on something and will not be talked out of it. Whatever she becomes, the story has treated her potential carefully enough to suggest that her role is not complete. And then there is Pluton. The ancient weapons are 3 in number, and they carry names drawn from the gods of the sea: Poseidon, Uranus, and Pluton. Poseidon, as mentioned, has been identified as Shirahoshi. Uranus remains mysterious, named but not yet placed in any revealed context, with enough clarity to say what it is or who carries it. But Pluton, described in ancient texts as a worship of apocalyptic capability, is confirmed to be somewhere beneath the soil of Wano. This was revealed by Kozuki Sukiyaki, Odin's father, in the depths beneath Wano where the ruins of an ancient kingdom were discovered. The ship is real. It is buried. It waits. The poneglyphs left by the Kozuki family include information about the ancient weapons, encoded in a script that only those with the appropriate knowledge can read, placed in locations that required the scattered poneglyphs to be gathered and combined before they would speak clearly. This was by design. The Kozuki clan understood that knowledge of the weapon's locations was dangerous, and built into the system of its transmission a requirement for collaboration, for multiple peoples working across generations to preserve the pieces. Robin, who can read the poneglyphs, is part of the thread that connects all of this. Her ability is not simply academic. It is the key that the ancient family built into the lock. What Pluton is intended to do in the context of the final conflict remains one of the story's genuinely open questions. The surface reading, that it is a weapon capable of destroying islands, is what everyone assumes. But there is another reading, one that sits more quietly alongside the role that Noah and the Sea Kings play near Fishman Island. If the world floods again, if the ancient power unleashed by the final war pushes ocean water across land and threatens the survival of peoples across every sea, then Pluton, as a ship of extraordinary size and capability, might not be a weapon of destruction at all. It might be a ship of survival. The name itself, in some mythological traditions, connects not to destruction, but to the underworld, the realm that receives what the surface world cannot hold. A ship built to carry things through catastrophe rather than to cause it. Both of Luffy's confirmed territories, Fishman Island and Wano, contain at their hearts something that looks like preparation for the end of the world. Not preparation for a battle, but preparation for what comes after. This symmetry feels intentional in the way that only Eiichiro Oda's intentional choices feel intentional. Quiet, patient, placed years before the meaning reveals itself. He has spoken in interviews about planning the story's ending from very early. The positions of Noah and Pluton in the 2 territories that Luffy has formally claimed suggest a design that runs deeper than any individual arc's plot. The reader who sat with the Fishman Island arc and noticed Noah and then sat with the Wano arc and heard Sukiyaki describe Pluton below the Earth, that reader was being shown something. The showing was spread across years and hundreds of chapters, but the two moments are in conversation with each other. The Grand Fleet is not a territory in the same way that Fishman Island and Wano are territories. There are no flags formally planted, no shogunates or kings who have formally transferred allegiance. What the Grand Fleet is, instead, is a gathering of captains who swore their loyalty to Luffy on the day of the Dressrosa celebration, pressing cups of sake to their lips and vowing subordination not because Luffy demanded it, but because they chose it freely and completely. Luffy tried to refuse them. He sat at the center of that ceremony in visible discomfort, not because he was ungrateful, but because accepting subordinates meant accepting responsibility in a form that felt different from simply fighting for the people in front of him. He does not think of himself as someone who leads people. He thinks of himself as someone who goes toward things that need to be addressed. His crewmates let him say his objection. Then Sabo poured the sake cups anyway, and the fleet was formed, and Luffy became the commander of 7 pirate crews across thousands of leagues of ocean, most of whom he had never met and most of whose home waters he had never sailed. The Grand Fleet operates on a principle established by Luffy's own words. They are free. They do not answer daily check-ins. They do not send tribute. They sail their own seas and live their own lives. And when the moment comes that the fleet is called, when the signal goes out and the need is real, they will come. That moment has not yet fully arrived, but the shape of it is forming. The levely, the reverie, sent ripples through the world that have not stopped moving. The abolition of the warlord system removed protections that several of Luffy's allies had relied on. The events in Mariajois that are still being revealed chapter by chapter are moving towards something that will eventually require every sworn blade to be drawn. When that moment comes, the Grand Fleet will not need to be summoned with ceremony. They will feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the first drop falls, in the air, in the silence before something breaks. And they will move. Cavendish arrived at the Corrida Coliseum in Dressrosa with something to prove, which is how he arrives most places. He is handsome in a way that he considers a gift to the world. He is talented in a way that borders on terrifying. And before the events of Dressrosa, he had spent a significant portion of his career being furious at the 11 supernovas for stealing his moment in the sun. His personal grudge against rookies of exceptional fame was, for a while, pointed directly at Luffy. In the Colosseum, he tried to eliminate him on multiple occasions, in the methodical way of a person who has decided something practical. But Dressrosa changed him, the way Dressrosa changed almost everyone who was there. He saw Luffy fight. He saw the will that moves beneath the fighting, the thing that has nothing to do with power rankings or bounty amounts, and everything to do with the refusal to leave while someone is still in danger. And something in Cavendish, underneath the vanity and the rivalry and the sword, that he has named Durandal, after one of the legendary blades of a distant mythology, recognized something it had been waiting to recognize. He knelt. He poured sake. He swore. Now he captains the beautiful pirates, and he carries a secret that only those closest to him fully understand. When he sleeps, another personality emerges. Hakuba, a fighter of almost incomprehensible speed that moves through enemies like wind through grass. This dual nature makes him unpredictable in battle in ways that even his allies must account for. He is one of the 7, and he has meant his oath. There are supporters in the One Piece world, and there are fans, and the difference is mostly one of scale. Bartolomeo is not simply a supporter of Luffy. He is a man whose entire identity was rewritten by witnessing a single event. The moment at Logtown when Monkey D. Luffy stood on the scaffold where Goldie Roger had been executed, laughed at the crowd, and was struck by lightning sent by a passing Logia user, and survived it as though the sky had simply been wrong about him. Bartolomeo was in that crowd. He was a young man with no particular direction, watching someone be about to die, and then watching that someone survive the moment in a way that made surviving seem like a natural outcome. From that day, he became a pirate, not to become king himself, but to support the man who would. His devil fruit, the Bari Bari no Mi, generates barriers of absolute solidity. Nothing passes through a Bartolomeo barrier. Cannonballs stop. Swords stop. Executives of the Don Quixote pirates stopped. The barriers can be formed offensively as well as defensively, shaped into compressed pieces of barrier matter and launched. In the events following Dressrosa, Bartolomeo took on a role that was less battlefield and more navigation. He guided several members of the Straw Hats through islands that might otherwise have been hostile, flying the Straw Hat flag from his own ship with an enthusiasm that bordered on the religious. He would consider this his honor. He would be correct that it is. Sai is the 13th successor to the Hapo Navy, a martial tradition that stretches back through generations of fighters who have combined open-hand combat with a style of kicking that channels force downward through the earth itself, strong enough to split rock and to break open stone floors under the feet of opponents. He arrived at the Corrida Coliseum representing his grandfather, Qin Zhao, whose history with Monkey D. Garp is complicated enough to have made their first meetings in Dressrosa genuinely tense. Qin Zhao had carried a grudge against the Monkey family for decades. Sai, to his credit, was willing to update his position when evidence presented itself. After Dressrosa, Sai returned to Kano country, where he assumed leadership. This detail matters in ways that the story has not yet fully articulated, because Kano country is a real nation, with real citizens, real ships, and a real military tradition rooted in the Hapo Navy's centuries of martial knowledge. When Luffy's final conflict comes, Sai brings not just himself, but a kingdom. He also brings his own complicated feelings about the whole situation, because Sai is a person of significant personal dignity, who did not expect to end up in formal subordination to a young man who once described the ceremony establishing that subordination as annoying. But he swore, and he meant it, and that is where the relationship rests. Ideo is not a man of many words, which makes him somewhat easier to describe. He is a fighter. He competes. He wins. His devil fruit, or more precisely, the physical modification that functions like one but operates through a technique called the destroy cannon, allows him to compress enormous force through his shoulders and arms, releasing it in explosive bursts that have been compared, in terms of visible effect, to artillery. At Dressrosa, he fought through the Colosseum with the focused intensity of someone for whom combat is a primary language. After swearing to Luffy, he returned to his own crew, the XXX Gym Martial Arts Alliance, and to the work of being a pirate in the ordinary sense, which for Ideo mostly means continuing to compete and to train. He is not the most prominent member of the Grand Fleet. He is not the one the history books will likely lead with. But the Grand Fleet is 7 crews, and each crew matters, and Ideo would be the last person to suggest otherwise, because he is not the sort of person who makes comparative arguments about relative importance. He swore. He is present. When the flag rises, he will be there. The Tantata are a people of small stature and enormous heart, living in the underground kingdom beneath Dressrosa, hidden from the surface world for most of their history by the simple fact that most people do not look carefully enough at the ground beneath their feet. Leo captains the Tantata pirates with a directness that is occasionally startling. He believes in things fully and expresses that belief without reservation, which is the kind of quality that either makes someone a very good leader or a very complicated one, depending entirely on whether the thing they are believing in is actually true. In Dressrosa, the Tantata had lived under the shadow of the Don Quixote family's manipulation, a shadow so old and so complete that the details of it had been woven into the folklore of their people as an obligation rather than as what it actually was, which was theft and exploitation. Seeing it named for what it was, seeing it ended. This was not a small thing for Leo or for anyone in the Tantata kingdom. His devil fruit, the Nui Nui no Mi, allows him to stitch things together through a surface using needle and thread in ways that defy conventional physics. Opponents can be stitched to the ground. Objects can be attached to each other. It is a power that sounds gentle and operates with a precision that makes it genuinely dangerous in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. Leo swore to Luffy with the full weight of the Tantata behind him, and the Tantata do not swear lightly. Orlumbus is in certain specific ways the most practically powerful member of the Grand Fleet that nobody talks about. He was, until his retirement at Dressrosa, the admiral of the Yonta Maria Grand Fleet, a naval force of massive size centered on a flagship, the Yonta Maria, that is by most standard measurements one of the largest ships in the known world. When he retired his admiralship, he did not dismantle the fleet. He took his ships with him. He took his crews with him. He swore to Luffy, and that oath was made not just by one man with a sword, but by a man who brought an armada to the ceremony. In any realistic accounting of what the Grand Fleet means in material terms, ships, cannons, personnel, ocean coverage, Orlumbus is a significant fraction of the total. He commands not just fighting ability, but sea presence, the kind that changes the dynamics of a naval engagement, simply by arriving in the area. He is understated about this, which is either genuine modesty or the confidence of a person who does not need to explain what his ships speak for themselves. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. There are several things that make Hadrudin different from every other captain in the Grand Fleet. The first is his size. He is a giant, not a large human, not a tall man, but a giant in the true sense, a person whose hand alone is larger than an ordinary human's torso, whose stride covers distances that would take an average person several steps to match. The second is his origin. Hadrudin is from Elbaf, the land of the giants, which sits somewhere in the Grand Line and which has appeared in the story mostly as a place that is promised rather than arrived at, mentioned in Usopp's dreams, visible as a destination on the story's horizon since the days of the Little Garden arc, present as a goal that keeps appearing just past whatever the current obstacle is. The third is his bloodline. Hadrudin is not simply from Elbaf. He is royalty. He is a prince of the giant nation, which means that when he swore himself to Luffy, he was making a promise that carries the weight of his entire people's leadership behind it. This is not a small thing. Elbaf has been built up across the length of the story as one of the most consequential locations that Luffy has not yet reached. The giants of Elbaf have their own military tradition, their own warrior code, their own gods, and their own stories. They are, by the measurement that the One Piece world applies to strength, among the most formidable peoples in existence. Dory and Brogy, the two giants whom the Straw Hats met on Little Garden, who had been fighting their centuries-long duel in the forest of an island nobody else visited, were giants of Elbaf. When they were reunited with their people and their king, the conversation that followed established the kind of warmth and mutual recognition that tends to precede formal alliance. Hadrudin, carrying the weight of all of this, is already Luffy's subordinate. When the Elbaf arc resolves, and its resolution feels as though it is coming, the way a season's end feels when the air begins to change, there is every reason to believe that the formal alliance between Luffy and the giant nation will be sealed by what happens there. The shape of that resolution is already suggested by Hadrudin's presence in the Grand Fleet. He is the prince. He chose Luffy before his people did, individually and ahead of time, and the story tends to reward those moments of individual choice with collective consequence. There is a category of relationship that sits between official territory and simple acquaintance, and it is occupied by the kingdoms that Luffy has passed through and saved without formalizing anything, without planting flags, without making announcements. These kingdoms know what he did. They remember. The people who live there, the rulers who remain in place because of choices he made, would answer a call if it came. They are not territories in the strict sense, but they are not neutral either. The distinction between official territory and aligned kingdom matters in practical terms, but in human terms, in the terms of what would actually happen when the final conflict of the story demands a response from every corner of the world, the distinction softens. Official territory means obligation. It means a flag and a promise, and the formal architecture of a Yonko's protection structure. Aligned kingdom means something less formal, but perhaps no less reliable. The kind of loyalty that forms not from ceremony, but from the specific memory of what someone did at a specific moment when it was needed. People remember being saved differently than they remember treaties. Treaties are written down and filed and revisited by lawyers when the terms become inconvenient. Being saved is carried in the body. It is the kind of memory that lives in the hands, in the throat, in the specific quality of the morning after the night when everything could have gone differently. Every person in every allied kingdom who was present on the day Luffy arrived carries that memory. Their children, told the story, carry something of it too. The telling shapes them, even at the distance of a generation. This is Luffy's Empire of the Unseen, the version of his territory that does not appear in any marine database, that cannot be counted by bounty hunters or evaluated by the five elders through their networks of informants. It is enormous. It is loyal, and it is made entirely of people who were not required to feel anything and felt it anyway. Alabasta is the kingdom at the heart of the Alabasta arc, which was for many years considered the first great arc of the series, the first time the story reached the full depth of what it was capable of being. Alabasta is a desert kingdom, ancient in the way that desert kingdoms tend to be ancient, built around a river, shaped by the rhythm of rain and drought, sustained by a relationship between the land and the people who know how to survive it. The Nile-adjacent quality of its geography is not accidental. Eiichiro Oda has described drawing on real-world historical cultures and geographies in constructing the nations of his world, and the visual and cultural language of Alabasta speaks clearly to that influence. The Alabasta crisis was manufactured. Baroque works, under the leadership of Crocodile, a warlord of the sea with a desert devil fruit that could pull moisture from any living thing it touched, had spent years engineering civil conflict within the kingdom. False rain clouds, poisoned water supplies, reports of the king's actions deliberately distorted until the people turned against him. It was a long, patient campaign of destruction. Crocodile's plan was elegant in the brutal way that plans built on patience tend to be. He did not need to conquer Alabasta openly. He needed only to make Alabasta destroy itself, remove the rain, dry the soil, starve the farms and the wells. Let the people's suffering translate into anger at the most visible symbol of authority, which is always the king. Princess Nefertari Vivi had been embedded inside Baroque works, learning the truth for years before she encountered the Straw Hats and asked for their help. The relationship between Vivi and the Straw Hats across the Alabasta arc is one of the warmest and most carefully developed connections in the story's early sections. She was not a passenger. She fought. She ran through a city that was trying to tear itself apart, and she screamed for people to stop. And the sound of her screaming was the sound of someone who genuinely loved the place they were trying to save. Luffy defeated Crocodile. The kingdom was saved. And then Vivi made a choice that sits in the story like a stone in a river, present, unmovable, changing the current around it. She stayed in Alabasta. She chose her country over the adventure. The Straw Hats left Alabasta and sailed away, and they did not look back, because Vivi had asked them not to by waving her fingers in the sign they had established as their private farewell. And that was officially the end. The memory of that farewell is one of the story's most quietly aching moments. Every crew member raised their arm. Not one of them looked back. Not because they did not feel it, but because Vivi had asked them not to, and they honored that. Except that it was not the end, because the story is not finished with Vivi. Her father, King Cobra, pursued questions there about the Void Century and about a name, Nefertari D, that connects their family to a lineage that the world government has spent centuries trying to erase. King Cobra sought an audience with the five elders, specifically to ask about this name, about the history it carried, about what it meant that his family bore it. Something happened at that reverie that the story has been carefully not revealing. Cobra went in. Sabo was reportedly there. The aftermath included Cobra and a condition that the story has handled obliquely, and Vivi's whereabouts becoming a subject of active uncertainty. What is clear is that Vivi carries the initial D in her name, that she knows things about Luffy that most allies do not know, and that wherever she is not simply waiting quietly in Alabasta for the world to resolve itself. The Nefertari family is one of the 20 royal families who founded the world government. Their decision to remain on their island rather than move to Mariojua was apparently the reason their bloodline retained the D. A quiet rebellion spanning centuries, maintained through the simple choice of not completing an expected migration. Alabasta is not a flagged territory. Its politics are too complicated for that. It is a world government kingdom, one of the original 20, with all the weight of that history attached. But Vivi is a D, and Luffy is a D. And the story has never yet let that kind of connection pass without consequence. Drum Island sits in the first half of the Grand Line, and it entered Luffy's history specifically because Nami was sick, and the only doctor anyone could name who might help was on an island nobody wanted to visit. This is the arc that gave the Straw Hats Tony Tony Chopper, which alone would make it one of the most significant stops on the journey. But there is more to Drum Island than Chopper. The kingdom there had been abandoned by its ruling family, while Paul's cowardice in the face of a Blackbeard pirate's attack had sent him fleeing, leaving his people without leadership and without the 100 doctors he had hoarded for his own use. Dalton, the soldier who had always believed in protecting the people even when his king did not, took leadership after Luffy defeated Wapol and threw him off the island. The kingdom was renamed Sakura Kingdom because Chopper suggested that cherry blossoms might grow in its snowy soil and because the people wanted to mark the beginning of something new. When Wapol returned years later with resources behind him and attempted to reclaim his throne, he was turned away. The kingdom had moved on. It had chosen its own direction. Dalton and the people of Sakura Kingdom remember Luffy. They remember Chopper, who was born there and who left from there to become a doctor worth the name. They would not be described as a military force in any meaningful strategic sense. The population is not large, the terrain is difficult, and the kingdom's primary strength is in the medical knowledge that Dr. Kureha and Chopper between them represent. But loyalty is loyalty, and there are many ways to contribute to a world in crisis beyond standing in a battle line. Dressrosa is the island where the Grand Fleet was born, which gives it a specific place in the structure of Luffy's relationships that goes beyond what happened to Dressrosa itself. The Dressrosa arc was in many ways One Piece at its most complicated. The interlocking stories, the Corrida Coliseum, the toy soldiers who were missing family members who did not remember them, the Tantata Underground Kingdom, the strings of Don Quixote do Flamingo, cutting through every layer of the island's life, required more attention and more pages to unfold than almost any arc before it. What Doflamingo had done to Dressrosa was different from what Crocodile had done to Alabasta or what Kaido had done to Wano. He had not simply oppressed the kingdom. He had replaced its reality. He had turned its people into toys, erasing them from the memory of everyone who knew them. He had built a criminal empire that operated openly as a kingdom, smiling at the world while running the Smile factory below. The liberation of Dressrosa involved most of the Straw Hats, the Full Law Alliance, the gladiators of the Colosseum, including former King Riku's retainer Kairos, and the Tantata people emerging from underground. King Riku Doldo III, restored to his throne, is a man of quiet and profound gratitude. He is not a military power. He is a symbol, and symbols matter in the game of world politics that the final arc will play. Dressrosa, like Alabasta, is a world government kingdom. It cannot fly Luffy's flag openly, It will not officially declare itself his territory in any political document. But Kairos is there, Rebecca is there, Leo and the Tontada are there. And among the Grand Fleet, the crew captains who swore to Luffy on Dressrosa soil carry that country's memory with them. Skypiea floats above the Grand Line on a layer of sea clouds so thick that you can walk on them, and below those clouds, the ocean continues its ordinary business, indifferent to what is suspended above it. The Scypians and the Shandians have lived on those clouds for generations, separated from the blue sea below by distance, and by the simple fact that you cannot reach Skypiea without navigating a knock-up stream, a natural phenomenon violent enough to destroy most ships that encounter it unprepared. When the Straw Hats arrived in Skypiea, they arrived in the middle of an old war. The Shandians and the Scypians had been fighting for centuries, and the introduction of the self-proclaimed god Enel had added a new dimension of cruelty to an already painful situation. Enel's Goro Goro no Mi, the lightning fruit, the power that made him effectively untouchable to every opponent he faced until he met someone whose body was made of rubber, had given him the delusional conviction of literal divinity. He intended to destroy Skypiea and sail to the moon, which he eventually did, though the moon turned out to be less welcoming than he had anticipated. Luffy's defeat of Enel in the City of Gold above the clouds gave both peoples peace, real peace, the first in hundreds of years, built on the moment when the ancient city of Shandora was finally seen and recognized by the descendants of both the people who had guarded it and the people who had come down from the sky to claim it. Wiper, the Shandian warrior, who fought with the fury of centuries of dispossession in his every movement, wept at that moment. The story gave him that without asking anything back from him. The Shandians and Scypians would help Luffy. This is not in question. Their loyalty is, in some ways, deeper and more unconditional than almost any other people he has met, because what he gave them was not just freedom from an oppressor, but the resolution of a grief so old it had become part of their identity. But Luffy left without saying goodbye. He sailed away while the Sky People were celebrating, and the story has not returned to show him accounting for that absence. Whether this is a detail that will be revisited or a detail that the story has simply not made time for, the relationship remains one of pure loyalty on their side, and of genuine but somewhat unexamined affection on his. Skypiea is not official territory. The distance is too great, the route too difficult, the connection too informal. But if Luffy were to send a message upward through a knock-up stream, the Shandians and Skypians would come down with their wings and their weapons and their centuries of accumulated warrior strength, and they would fight for him with the whole weight of everything he returned to them. Water 7 is one of the most beautiful cities in the known world. If you appreciate cities that are also partially submerged in seawater and whose streets include canals deep enough to navigate by boat. The people there have spent generations mastering the craft of shipbuilding. The Galley La Company, under the leadership of Iceberg, builds ships that sail every sea in the world. The Frankie family, before Frankie himself joined the Straw Hats, had been a fixture of the city's less official economy. Luffy's relationship with Water 7 is complicated in a specific way. The people there like him. Iceberg is alive because of choices Luffy made. The city celebrated the Straw Hats after the events at Enies Lobby in a way that suggested genuine affection. But Water 7 sits very close to some of the most concentrated points of marine presence in the first half of the Grand Line. The former Marineford, now moved but once the headquarters of the entire marine organization, was a short distance away by sea. Enies Lobby, the judicial island where the world government processes its prisoners, is nearby. Impel Down, the underwater prison that holds the world's most dangerous criminals, sits within the same general region. For a city of civilians and craftspeople to formally ally itself with a pirate in that geographic position would be to invite attention from forces it is not equipped to resist. The Marines would not need to mount a campaign against Water 7. They would simply need to show up, and the city would be in immediate danger. Iceberg understands this. He is a practical man, with a long history of working around the obstacles that the world presents to him. His response to the situation appears to be the project he has undertaken, the transformation of Water 7 itself into something mobile, a city that can be moved, a ship that is also a city. If Water 7 eventually floats free of the Grand Line's most watched waterways, the political calculus changes entirely. And in the event of a world flood, a ship that is also a city would not sink. It would simply continue doing what it has always done. Amazon Lily is the island of women in the Calm Belt, a stretch of ocean that has no wind and is populated by enormous sea kings, which historically made it inaccessible to all but the most capable navigators. The Kuja pirates, who live on Amazon Lily, are exceptional warriors. Their tradition links beauty to power in a way that is not metaphorical. The Kuja believe that haki manifests physically as an expression of one's inner spirit, and that the perfection of fighting ability is connected to the perfection of one's self in every dimension. Boa Hancock, the most powerful of the Kuja, is the bearer of the love fruit, which can petrify anyone who feels desire or attraction toward her. She is also a Conqueror's Haki user, a rare ability that marks her as someone capable of dominating the will of those around her simply by releasing it. She was, before the events of the story reshaped everything, a warlord of the sea. That status offered Amazon Lily a degree of protection from marine attention that its isolated location in the Calm Belt alone might not have guaranteed. When the warlord system was abolished by the world government, following the events of the Reverie, that protection disappeared. Chapter 1059 showed the consequences directly. The Marines came to Amazon Lily to capture Boa Hancock, and the island faced attack. Luffy was not there. He did not come. This is not a statement about his feelings toward Boa Hancock or toward Amazon Lily. It is simply a logistical reality. He was occupied elsewhere, and the situation resolved itself through other means, specifically through the arrival of Blackbeard, which introduced a different set of complications. But the absence matters symbolically. It establishes Amazon Lily as a place that is loyal to Luffy without that loyalty being formalized into any kind of mutual obligation. The Kuja love him, individually and collectively, in varying registers of intensity. They would fight for him, but Amazon Lily cannot officially be called his territory. The mutual contract of protection, the thing that makes a territory, has not been established in the way it was at Fishman Island or at Wano. Dawn Island is where Luffy grew up. Fuchsia Village at its edge is where the barrel was, the barrel where he waited on the day that would change his life. The mountain bandits, the red-haired pirates, Shanks. Luffy's love for Dawn Island is not in question. It is in his bones the way most people's hometowns are in their bones, present in the specific way the light looks over a particular hill at a particular time of day, in the sound of a specific person's voice, in the memory of a meal eaten quickly before running back out into the afternoon. He would come back if it needed him. This is certain. The people of Fuchsia Village, Makino, who was kind when the mountain bandit Higuma came, who kept serving sake with a steadiness that the story remembered when it wanted to say something about what grace looks like under pressure. Remember Luffy. They watched him leave. They watched the red-hair pirates sail away after him. They have been keeping the memory of that morning for most of the story's run. Daden, the mountain bandit who raised Luffy and Ace and Sabo in the forest of the Goa Kingdom's Grey Terminal. She did not sign up to care about children. She was pressured into it by Monkey D. Garp, who dropped 3 boys into her already complicated life and then sailed away satisfied. And yet she cared. She cared in the rough, practical, nonverbal way of someone who will not admit it while the option of not admitting it remains available. She knows Luffy is alive. She probably knows what he has become, because the name Monkey D. Luffy and his bounty have been impossible to miss for anyone in the world who occasionally looks at news dials or wanted posters. But it is not his territory. 2 things prevent it from being his territory. The first is the political structure of Dawn Island itself. The Goa Kingdom, which governs the island, is a world government member. Its current ruler, Stelly, is not a person whose priorities align with Luffy in any meaningful way. Stelly is the adopted brother of Sabo, and his presence in the story is associated with small-mindedness and political ambition, the kind that serves itself without caring particularly who is harmed by it. The second is that someone else is already there in the way that counts. Shanks spent years in Fuchsia Village. The Straw Hat, the one that sits on Luffy's head and has sailed with him across every ocean he has crossed, was given to him by Shanks in that village. Shanks protected Fuchsia. Shanks made promises there. When you think about which Yonko has the primary relationship with Dawn Island, the answer is Shanks, not Luffy. The timeline, the direct action, the ongoing implicit protection. It all points the same way. The relationship between Luffy and Shanks, stretched across the whole story, is one of its most carefully maintained threads. They have not met since the day Shanks lost his arm to the Sea King in the bay at Fuchsia. Every meaningful thing that has happened between them since has been mediated by distance, by the hat, by reputation, by occasional intercepted communications, by the choices each of them makes when the other's name comes up in conversation. Luffy does not need to claim his hometown to love it, and he would not need a flag there to show up the moment it needed him. But it is not his territory, and the story seems to know this clearly. The East Blue is the weakest of the four seas. This is not an insult to the people who live there. It is a structural fact about the distribution of strength and danger in the One Piece world, where the Grand Line concentrates the world's most extreme everything, and the surrounding seas are quieter in comparison. Luffy grew up in the East Blue. The Straw Hat crew was assembled there, one person at a time, on islands that each gave the story something essential. Shell's Town, where the first crew member was recruited. Roronoa Zoro, sitting tied to a post in a marine base, refusing to give up his swords for anyone. Syrup Village, where Usopp was telling lies that were actually truths about what was coming. The Barati, floating restaurant and training ground for some of the finest sea cooks in the world, where Sanji was found. The Konomi Islands, in Arlong Park, where Nami's island had been under the control of Arlong's fishman crew for years. Each of these islands remembers Luffy. Each of these islands has people in them who would recognize his name and feel something when they heard it. Shell's Town has Kobe, who was a cabin boy for the Alvida pirates when Luffy found him inside a barrel and who left that crew to become a marine. Driven by a dream of his own, Kobe has grown across the story in ways that the early chapters did not anticipate. He was at Marineford. He called for the fighting to stop, in a moment that cost him enormously and that the story chose to preserve with the care it reserves for things it considers important. He is now a vice admiral in training, under Garp's distant guidance. Kobe is not Luffy's ally in the formal sense. He is a marine. But the relationship between them, the origin, the friendship, the parallel dreams that diverge in direction without losing their shared root, is one of the story's oldest and most carefully maintained emotional threads. Syrup Village has Kaya, Usopp's childhood friend, who is studying medicine, and who Usopp dreams of sailing back to sea. The stories Usopp told her on her sickbed were true in all the ways that matter, even when the facts were invented. She knows this. She has always known this, in the way that people who care about someone know the shape of their truth, even when the literal content is fabricated. The Konomi Islands have Nami's village. Kokoyasi, renamed from what it was under Arlong's occupation, and Genzo, who carried the straw hat Jolly Roger pinned to his chest under his coat during the years when raising it openly would have been dangerous, carrying the symbol of the person who freed them as a private act of faith. These are not warriors. They are not resources in any strategic sense. They are the people who were present at the first chapters of Luffy's story, and the story has never suggested that their presence was anything other than permanent. But the East Blue as a whole is too diffuse, too politically varied, too distant from the Grand Line's final conflict to be described as a territory in any meaningful sense. The islands there have their own relationships with the world government. They have marine bases. They have their own local politics that have very little to do with what is happening in the New World. What the East Blue gave Luffy is not territory, it is origin. It is the place where the Straw Hat Pirates first came to be, assembled piece by piece across a sea that would later seem very small in comparison to where they went. These islands will not send fighters to the final war, but they are part of him in the way that beginnings are always part of what grows from them. Rusukaina is not a kingdom. It does not have a flag. Nobody lives there intentionally. What Rusukaina has is fauna, creatures of extraordinary power, hundreds of species across varying levels of lethality, living in an ecology so dangerous that Silver's Rayleigh, a man who was first mate to the Pirate King, a man who can coat his body in hockey dense enough to stop an admiral's strike, chose it as the training ground for Monkey D. Luffy, specifically because surviving it would require everything he had, and then more. For a year and a half, Luffy lived on Rusukaina. He fought its beasts. He was defeated by them. He recovered and fought again. He tested hockey against opponents who had no interest in pedagogy or pacing, only in the continuation of their own lives against the thing in the straw hat that would not stop coming at them. By the time he left, he had not simply learned to coexist with the island's creatures. He had earned their acknowledgement. The beasts of Rusukaina, not through domestication, but through the simple force of repeated encounter, recognized him as the strongest thing on the island. This is a peculiar kind of authority over a peculiar kind of place. Rusukaina cannot send soldiers anywhere. Its creatures cannot navigate ships. But there is something that this island represents in the larger picture that is worth sitting with quietly. If a ship large enough came to Rusukaina, large enough to carry creatures of that size and strength, the beasts that recognized Luffy would board it. They would come. They would fight for him the way all wild things fight, without strategy, without hesitation, without the weight of thinking about what they stand to lose. The vision of that ship and of those creatures disembarking at a battlefield is one that the story has not yet shown, but that the groundwork quietly supports. There is also something worth noticing in the fact that Rayleigh chose Rusukaina specifically. He could have trained Luffy anywhere. He could have taken him to a quieter island and built the curriculum, deliberately, controlling the variables. Instead, he placed Luffy in an environment that was entirely honest, that offered no mercy, held no particular investment in his survival, and rewarded only actual improvement. What Luffy learned on Rusukaina was not a technique or a system. It was a relationship with his own limits, specifically the practice of finding where those limits end, and then discovering that the thing beyond them is not emptiness, but a new floor. This is the lesson that all the great fighters in the One Piece world have absorbed, each in their own way. Rayleigh simply gave Luffy an island that would teach it by brute repetition. The beasts of Rusukaina remember him now, and memory, in the One Piece world, tends to matter. It is worth returning to Dressrosa not just as the birthplace of the Grand Fleet, but as a place with its own specific geography of loyalty. Riku Doldo III is not a powerful king by the world's standard measurements. He does not have a large army. His kingdom spent years under Doflamingo's control, its people converted into toys, and its memory of its own true history suppressed. The restoration of the Riku family to the throne was an act of recovery rather than an act of power. But he has a specific quality that matters more than military strength in the game of the final arc. He is respected, genuinely, not feared, not tolerated, but respected in the way that comes from years of visible integrity. His granddaughter Rebecca is the story's emblem of what Dressrosa was before Doflamingo's control. Warm, human, oriented toward life rather than toward conflict. She trained as a gladiator because she had no other choice, and she fought with a style designed never to harm anyone, only to survive. Kairos, her father, is a different matter entirely. He was once the greatest gladiator Dressrosa had ever produced, a man who had fought in the Colosseum over 1,000 times without losing. Converted into a toy, forgotten by his daughter, forgotten by everyone who had loved him, He fought for Dressrosa through years of that forgetting without once stopping. When his humanity was returned to him, his ability did not leave with the toy form. He stood on one leg and cut Doflamingo's head off in a single stroke, a strike that landed before Doflamingo fully understood what was happening. Dressrosa has Kairos, and Kairos, for Luffy, would travel anywhere. Zoo is an island that sits on the back of an enormous elephant. This sentence reads as metaphor. It is not metaphor. Zunatia is one of the ancient giant elephants that have walked the oceans of the world for countless centuries. It walks in a circuit across the New World, carrying on its back a jungle ecosystem and the civilization of the minks, a people of extraordinary strength, and wolf and cat, and bear and rabbit, and every other animal anatomy. Bipedal, elegant, capable of fighting at levels that surprised even the most seasoned Straw Hat crew members when they arrived. The minks have a tradition of hospitality toward travelers who arrive without hostile intent, and a tradition of absolute commitment toward anyone they have decided to protect. These two qualities combined make them among the most reliably loyal peoples in the world. Their combat tradition is built around electro, a form of biological electricity generated by the mink body itself, without any devil fruit required. Every mink carries this ability to some degree. Elite mink warriors use it at levels that electrocute opponents mid-combat or send arcing current through water to affect multiple targets at once. Inuarashi and Nekomamushi, in their base forms, already operate at a level well above most human fighters their size. The minks had been devastated by Jack of the Beast's pirates before the Straw Hats reached Sue. Their injured were everywhere. Their duke and their king, Inuarashi and Nekomamushi, had fought Jack alternately, one resting while the other engaged, for a day and a night without stopping, refusing to both be awake at the same time because of an old conflict between them that they had made a personal rule about. Jack of the Beast's pirates was not a small threat. He was one of Kaido's 3 disasters, a calamity-ranked executive carrying a bounty that placed him in the discussion of the world's most dangerous pirates. The fact that Inuarashi and Nekomamushi held him to a draw through exhausted repetition, each sleeping while the other fought, for an entire day and night, says something specific and significant about what the minks are capable of when their island and their people require it. The reason the minks had suffered Jack's assault was because they were protecting the Red Scabbards. The Kozuki family's retainers were hiding on Zoo, and the minks chose silence and physical destruction over betrayal. This is the kind of people the minks are. This is the foundation of the relationship. When Luffy arrived, the alliance between the minks and the Kozuki clan and the Straw Hats was formalized in the way alliances in the story tend to be formalized. Quickly, practically, driven by the fact that the goal at hand required everyone present to be committed to the same direction. The minks are now formally allies of Luffy. They went to Wano. They fought at Onigashima. In Sulong form, Inuarashi and Nekomamushi are, there is no diplomatic way to say this, very difficult to survive. The Sulong transformation is triggered by the full moon. Under the light of the complete moon, minks who have the capacity for it transform into a heightened state, white fur, dramatically amplified strength, speed, and electrical output. The cost is significant. Maintaining the form drains the user rapidly, and the transformation cannot be held indefinitely. But in the time they can hold it, a Sulong mink is among the most fearsome things on any battlefield they choose to occupy. Pedro, the mink who gave his life in Tadoland to allow the Straw Hats to escape with what they needed, he is remembered. His sacrifice is carried by his people and by the crew he helped. The story places his memory carefully, not as weight, but as direction. He believed in the new age, he said so. And then he made the choice that made the new age a little more possible. Zoo is unusual among Luffy's allied places in that it physically moves, carried by Zunetia's endless circuit of the New World. This mobility means that Zoo cannot be attacked or besieged in the conventional sense. It also means that Zunetia himself, ancient, enormous, accompanied by the sound of drums that might be his own heartbeat or might be something older, is a factor in any calculation that involves Zu. Zunesha carries a crime from the ancient past. The nature of that crime is connected to the Void Century, to Joy Boy, to the order that condemned Zunesha to walk forever without being allowed to defend itself except when commanded. For centuries, perhaps millennia, Zunesha walked the sea without being able to respond to attack, except with its body moving, which could not be directed toward combat. Momonosuke heard Zunesha's voice. He gave Zunesha a command. The connection between the Kozuki lineage and Zunesha runs deep into the Void Century, and its full meaning is still resolving. Zunesha has been waiting for something for a very long time. The specifics of that waiting are connected to Joy Boy, whose name has appeared in the deepest chapters of the story's history, and whose relationship to Luffy is one of the threads the story has been slowly, carefully gathering. When the time comes, Zunesha will move toward wherever Luffy is, not because of an order, because of what he was waiting for. The drums the minks hear in Zunesha's approach, the sound that travels through the water and through the earth of his back and into the feet of anyone standing on Zu. That sound is old. It is older than the minks who hear it, and it has been moving in the same direction for longer than anyone alive has been watching. Elbaf has been a destination since Usopp, young and terrified and lying through his teeth on the deck of the Going Merry, first described it as the village of warriors where brave men lived. He has wanted to go there since before most of the people who would eventually join his crew even knew he existed. The giants of Elbaf carry their culture in weapons and in stories. Their warrior code, Elbaf's tradition of single combat, of honor in the field, of the respect owed to strength regardless of whose it is, has been described through the lens of Dory and Brogy, two warriors who fought for 100 years on Little Garden over an argument neither of them could fully remember anymore, but who refused to leave because their honor demanded the resolution of what had started. 100 years. Two people. The same argument. This is not stubbornness in the way the word is usually applied. It is something older and more specific. A commitment to the idea that things begun must be finished, that the beginning of a conflict carries an obligation that does not dissolve simply because time has passed and the original context has faded. The giants of Elbaf believe in this. They believe it at the level of structure, at the level of the code that defines what it means to be from where they are from. Luffy's own quality of absolute commitment, his refusal to abandon a goal once stated, his insistence on returning for people left behind, his literal inability to let go of things that matter, resonates with Elbaf's values at a frequency that feels like recognition. When the Little Garden arc ended, Dory and Brogy did not come with the Straw Hats. But years later, when the need was extreme enough, Dory and Brogy arrived in the waters of Dressrosa with the new giant warrior pirates behind them. They came for Hadruddin, yes, but also for something less specific, for the pull of a story that was moving towards something they wanted to be part of. They had each other's backs across a century of combat. The idea that they would leave Luffy's story incomplete, once they had been included in it, sits badly with everything the story has established about who they are. Elbaf has not yet been reached. The Straw Hats have been heading there through the Egghead arc and the transitions that follow it, and the anticipation that has built across decades of storytelling is enormous, quiet, shaped by the certainty that when they arrive, what happens will matter. The giant nation commands respect on a scale that most other peoples in the story do not. Whitebeard himself did not attack Elbaf, a fact noted with the gravity appropriate to things that powerful men choose to leave alone. The giants have a naval capability that does not require sophisticated fleet coordination because individual giant warriors can single-handedly alter the dynamics of a ship battle. One giant pulling down a mast, turning a vessel's hull with bare hands, wading through water that would reach a human's chest as though it were a brook. These are not dramatic exaggerations in the One Piece world. They are the practical reality of what giants are. Hadruddin is already Luffy's subordinate, a prince of Elbaf, sworn to his service before his people were. The king of Elbaf, Loki, exists in the story as a name rather than yet as a presence. His name was given by Pudding's description of an arranged marriage that Big Mom had been pursuing. Charlotte Limlin wanted Elbaf's giants, their strength, their ships, their warrior capacity, folded into her own territory through a political union. This plan failed. Loki rejected it. The details of that rejection are not fully revealed, but its consequence is that Elbaf sits outside Big Mom's former sphere of influence and, with Big Mom's defeat, outside anyone's formal sphere. Perhaps it is also worth noting that Big Mom's desire to have the giants of Elbaf was not simply strategic. It was personal in the way that Charlotte Linland's desires tend to be personal, vast and consuming, and organized around the image of a dream she had carried since childhood. She had attended Elbaf as a child, briefly, disastrously, and what happened there shaped her relationship with the giants for the rest of her life. The story of Big Mom in Elbaf is one of the arc's most anticipated revelations, not only for what it says about her, but for what it says about what Elbaf itself will mean. When Luffy arrives, the arc that unfolds will almost certainly end with Elbaf formally joining his alliance. The narrative logic of the preparation, Hadradin's oath, Usopp's dream, the story's patient cultivation of this destination, points nowhere else. An Elbaf in Luffy's camp is not simply an ally. It is the giant nation. It is Dory and Brogy leading fleets. It is warriors who have trained in a tradition that has been unchanged since before the Grand Line took its current shape. It is a people who believe in something and who will follow that belief to whatever it costs them. The final conflict of One Piece will likely involve forces that seem, in the early stages of imagining it, impossible to overcome. The world government has admirals. It has an ancient history of violence in defense of its own continuation. It has the Five Elders, whose true nature is still revealing itself. Beings whose power and age place them in a category that the story spent a long time quietly suggesting before beginning to openly confirm. Against all of that, Luffy has Fishman Island and its Sea Kings and its ancient ship. He has Wano and its samurai and its princess, who is also a weapon and its ancient warship sleeping in the dark earth. He has the Grand Fleet, 7 crews, sworn freely. He has Zoo and its minks and the elephant that has been waiting since before modern memory. He has the allied kingdoms, Alabasta, Dressrosa, Sakura Kingdom, Drum Island, each contributing loyalty and political weight and the specific abilities of specific people who remember what Luffy gave them. And he will have Elbaf. Still, even with all of this laid out, it is worth pausing on the quality of what makes this alliance different from anything the world has seen before. Big Mom had a territory larger in geographic scope. Kaido had an army built on the industrial production of devil fruits, engineered toward maximum combat efficiency. Whitebeard had a family built on genuine love and on decades of shared history. What Luffy has is people who were freed. Each alliance is the residue of a liberation. Each territory is a place that existed in a kind of captivity, political, emotional, physical, and was released from it by the arrival of a person who did not calculate the risk before acting. This is not a weakness in the alliance. It is its defining strength. People who were freed for the right reasons do not fight with the energy of obligation. They fight with something closer to joy, the particular ferocity of someone who knows what the alternative looked like and has decided it will not return. At the very edge of all territories, at the farthest point the story has named without yet fully describing, is Laughtale. Laughtale is the final island, the island that only one crew has reached in the living memory of anyone who might be asked. Roger Pirates. Roger himself, the Pirate King. The One Piece left there as a message and as a gift from one era to the next. The name of the island itself was a mystery for most of the story's run. It was rendered differently in various translations and readings, and the question of what it was actually called and why was one of those small, persistent uncertainties that long-running stories accumulate the way ships accumulate barnacles. When it was finally revealed as Laughtale, named because the Roger pirates laughed when they found it, the name became one of the story's most resonant details. They laughed. The greatest treasure in the world, the culmination of a voyage that had taken years and cost lives, and redefined what was possible. And they laughed when they found it. Roger told Whitebeard about this. He told him that they arrived too early, that what they found was extraordinary, but that the moment for it was not yet, that someone born in a future time would inherit what Roger had reached, and that person would be able to do with it what Roger himself could not. Whitebeard believed him, and in the moments before Whitebeard died at Marineford, surrounded by destruction, he spoke about the new era and the One Piece, and the certainty with which he held both. It is not a territory in any conventional sense. It cannot be governed or defended or settled. It is a punctuation mark on the story of the world, the place where everything the poneglyphs have been pointing toward finally reveals itself. What Luffy will find there, when he finds it, will be the truth that the world government has been suppressing since the Void Century. What it will mean for his role in the story that follows, and for the people who call themselves his allies, or his territory, is something that only the completion of the story will reveal. But there is a connection worth noticing. Every territory Luffy has claimed, every people whose loyalty he carries without demanding it, every crew who swore sake cups and meant every drop, all of it has been preparing, whether anyone intended it to or not, for what comes after. The story of Joy Boy, the ancient figure whose name keeps appearing at the roots of every mystery, whose promise was left for someone born centuries later. The story has been suggesting for some time now that the fulfillment of that promise belongs to Luffy. The Gomu Gomu no Mi, the rubber fruit, which Luffy ate as a child, from Shanks's treasure chest, which defined his body and his fighting style and his entire existence from that moment forward, turned out to not be the Gomu Gomu no Mi at all. The Nika Nika no Mi, the human fruit, model Nika. The fruit of the sun god, the mythical fighter who came to those who suffered and made them laugh, the being whose body was said to be made of rubber and whose freedom was absolute and whose joy was contagious. Joy Boy was Nika, or the first person to carry Nika's power was Joy Boy. The distinction may matter, or the distinction may be the kind of line the story intentionally leaves blurry, because the answer lives somewhere between identity and inheritance. Luffy is the current carrier, and when Gear 5 awakened and the drum of liberation sounded for the first time in the current era, Zunesha heard it and recognized it, and said, "Joy Boy has returned." All of this converges on Laughtale in ways that are still being revealed. The One Piece, whatever it is, will require someone who understands what Joy Boy was trying to do, someone who carries the same power and the same essential spirit and the same absolute refusal to allow suffering to continue unchallenged. Luffy has never thought of himself in these terms. He has never sat quietly and considered his place in the long arc of history, or his relationship to an ancient figure who lived in the Void Century. He does not think about his territories as a legacy or as preparation for anything larger than the next meal. But the territories think about themselves that way, even if he does not. Fishman Island, Wano, the Grand Fleet, Zoo, Alabasta, Dressrosa, Elbaf to come. Each of them carries a piece of something that is assembling itself around a person who has not noticed, and will probably not notice until the moment when noticing is unavoidable, and the assembled thing needs to be used. Not because Luffy knew, not because he planned for it, because he walked into places where people were suffering and decided, without ceremony, that it needed to stop. When you lay out the full map, Fishman Island, Wano, the Grand Fleet, Zoo, and the Minks, the allied kingdoms across both halves of the Grand Line, the eastern starting points that remain home, it is large. It is large in a way that is still surprising when you look at it all at once, because Luffy assembled it almost entirely as a consequence of his character, rather than as a project. He never sat down and calculated which kingdoms would be useful in a final war. He never evaluated which devil fruit abilities would complement each other in a large scale naval engagement. He never made a list. He simply moved forward, and the people he moved through remembered, and the world that remembered is this world, spread across oceans, diverse in strength and in kind, united by the specific way it feels when someone who could have passed by chooses not to. Against the world government, which has had centuries to build the structure of its power, and which has the entire apparatus of the marine hierarchy, the warlord system, now defunct, and whatever ancient weapons it controls through the five elders, Luffy's alliance looks, on paper, like an underdog story. This is how his stories tend to begin. It is not, historically, how they tend to end. There are still territories that have not yet been reached. There are still alliances that have not yet been formalized. The Elbaf arc has not yet concluded. The full nature of Joy Boy's relationship to everything that has happened has not yet been stated plainly. The story is moving toward its final shape with the patience of something that has been building for a very long time, and the territories that Luffy carries, some flagged, some unflagged, some sworn formally, and some bound by nothing more than memory and gratitude, are all part of that shape. It is worth sitting for a moment with the geographic scale of what is being described. Fishman Island is at the base of the red line where the first and second halves of the Grand Line are connected. Wano is in the New World, far past the point where most ships have already been turned around by the severity of the sea. Zu moves between them. Alabasta is in the first half of the Grand Line. Dressrosa is in the first half. Drum Island is in the first half. The East Blue is beyond all of them, the quietest sea. The Grand Fleet is literally spread across every ocean in the world. This is not an alliance that can be contained or predicted from any single strategic position. When Luffy calls, the response will come from every direction, from below the ocean, from the walking islands, from the giant nation's harbors, from deserts and snowfields, and cities built on water. No Yonko has commanded this kind of geographic distribution. No marine strategy anticipates fighting an alliance whose members are simultaneously present in the East Blue, the first half of the Grand Line, the New World, and somewhere beneath the sea itself. Now, we have described the divisuals of Rivet City of Now, diffraction at each destination and an area, the heritage of the bottom. Of every hour of the week, the settlement of Rivet City of Now perceives faint dimension of disagreement, and this is before Elbaf, before whatever emerges from the Egghead arc, before the pieces that are still moving into place. Fishman Island rests below the ocean, its king's flag flying, its ancient weapon watching the deep water. Wano stands free on its New World cliff, its samurai sharpening swords for a call that has not yet come. The Grand Fleet sails 7 different waters, 7 captains carrying the weight of a sake cup they lifted freely. Zu walks its ancient circuit, Zunacia's footsteps sending ripples across the sea that do not reach the surface, as waves, but as something quieter. Alabasta holds its secrets, and its princess, Dressrosa, holds its gratitude. Drum Island holds its cherry blossoms in the snow. The minks of Zu, their white fur in the moonlight, their lightning running between their fingers, move through their jungle above the sea, waiting. The red scabbards of Wano, Kinemon, who crossed centuries by accident and arrived in a time not his own and adapted to it because there was no other choice, sit with their swords across their knees and their memories intact. The 7 captains of the Grand Fleet, Cavendish checking the edge of Durandal in a lantern's light, Bartolomeo replacing something he broke because of excessive enthusiasm about flags, Sai practicing kata in the morning cold, Ideo wrapping his hands before a workout that will take most of the day, Leo running a needle through something that does not want to be stitched, Hadrudin looking at the horizon with the patience of someone who has several decades before they are considered middle-aged. By the standards of their people, Orlumbus reviewing charts of waters his fleet is moving through, each of them carrying the weight of a promise that has not yet been called upon. And somewhere, on a sea that still has more of itself to reveal, a young man in a straw hat is moving forward toward the next thing that needs addressing. He has not counted his territories. He has not mapped his alliances or calculated the military value of his friendships. He will probably be surprised in the end by how much assembled itself behind him while he was looking at what was ahead. He is simply moving. And what he leaves behind is what it has always been: people who were given something they did not expect, standing in the places they were given it, waiting for the moment when the giving and the receiving and the long years between them will mean something that none of them can fully see yet. That moment is coming. The sea has been this quiet before, in the long pause before something enormous changes. And the people who have lived through those pauses know what the silence means. They are already awake. They are already facing the right direction. They are simply waiting for the sound of drums that does not belong to any ship they know. The sound that is older than the Grand Line, and older than the world government, and older than the names they use for everything. The sound that their bodies recognize before their minds do. The sound that says, "The time has come." Thanks for drifting through these One Piece stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new.